There are quiet evenings when Winston, a small mouse dressed in a slightly worn but carefully pressed suit, sits alone at the edge of his wooden desk, his tiny paws resting beside a dimly glowing phone screen that reflects in his thoughtful eyes, and on that screen is a number, his bank balance. Nothing alarming, nothing impressive, just a figure that seems stable enough to keep him calm yet fragile enough to make him uneasy. And as he stares at it, a familiar question slowly rises in his mind. One that he has asked himself more times than he cares to admit. Is he actually doing fine, or is he simply surviving in a carefully disguised version of financial instability? Because from the outside, Winston appears to be doing everything right. He works diligently every day. He pays his bills on time. He avoids reckless decisions, and he even manages to save a little. But despite all of this, something feels off, as if he is running on a wheel that never truly moves him forward. And what Winston does not fully realize yet is that he is not alone in this quiet confusion, because there are countless others just like him. Individuals who are not failing dramatically, but are also not progressing meaningfully, trapped in a cycle where effort does not translate into freedom, where income does not translate into security, and where time quietly erodes opportunity without making a sound. And the most unsettling part of it all is that this situation is not caused by bad luck, nor by a lack of intelligence, nor even by a lack of discipline, but rather by a series of small, seemingly harmless financial behaviors that slowly accumulate over years, forming invisible chains that hold him exactly where he is, preventing him from ever stepping beyond the boundaries of mediocrity, while giving him just enough comfort to never question the system he is trapped in. As the days pass, Winston continues his routine with quiet discipline, waking up early, adjusting his neatly pressed suit, and stepping out into a world that constantly reassures him that he is on the right path, because everywhere he looks there are signs of what appears to be success. Neighbors upgrading to larger homes, colleagues arriving in newer cars, friends sharing moments from vacations that seem well-earned and deserved, and slowly, without even noticing it, Winston begins to measure his own progress against these external markers, convincing himself that as long as he is keeping up, he must be doing fine. Yet beneath this surface-level comfort lies a far more fragile reality, one that rarely gets discussed, because despite earning a stable income and maintaining what looks like a respectable lifestyle, Winston is living dangerously close to the edge, where a single unexpected expense, a medical bill, a sudden repair, or a temporary loss of income, could disrupt everything he has built. And this is where the illusion becomes most dangerous, because it doesn't feel like a trap. It feels like normal life. And that is precisely why it is so effective, as it quietly conditions him to accept a standard of living that grows in parallel with his income, ensuring that no matter how much more he earns, his financial position never truly improves, creating a loop where progress is always visible but never real, and over time, this pattern becomes so normalized that questioning it feels almost unnecessary, even uncomfortable, because it would mean confronting the possibility that all his effort has been maintaining an illusion rather than building true security. And so Winston continues forward, unaware that what he believes to be stability is in fact a carefully balanced state of vulnerability, one that keeps him moving but never allows him to break free. One evening, as Winston scrolls absent-mindedly through his phone, he pauses for a moment on an app that he rarely opens, an investment account that he had signed up for years ago through a workplace program. And as he looks at the numbers, some gains, some fluctuations, he feels a vague sense of reassurance, as if simply having money invested is enough to guarantee a better future. Yet if he were to be completely honest with himself, he wouldn't be able to explain what he actually owns, how it works, or why those investments were chosen in the first place. And this realization, though subtle, reveals one of the most dangerous traps he has fallen into. Because while Winston would never consider buying something as simple as a new appliance without carefully comparing options, reading reviews, and understanding the features, he has somehow allowed decisions involving the largest pool of money he will ever accumulate to operate entirely on autopilot, trusting default settings, vague recommendations, or systems he never truly examined. And over time, this passive approach quietly shapes his financial destiny in ways he cannot see. As small differences in fees, asset allocation, and long-term returns begin to compound into outcomes that are dramatically different, even though the starting point may have been identical to someone else who chose to understand just a little more. And what makes this trap so deceptive is that it doesn't produce immediate pain. There are no alarms, no obvious losses, just a slow divergence between what could have been and what actually is, a gap that widens year after year until one day, far in the future, it becomes impossible to ignore. And by then, the cost of that early ignorance is no longer measured in small percentages, but in years of delayed freedom, missed opportunities, and a version of life that could have looked entirely different had Winston taken the time to understand the quiet forces shaping his money from the very beginning. Not long after becoming slightly more aware of his investments, Winston begins to feel something new, a subtle sense of curiosity mixed with confidence, as he notices how the numbers in his account move up and down with the rhythm of the market. And at first, it seems harmless, even logical, to think that if he can observe these patterns, perhaps he can act on them. Perhaps he can buy when things look promising and step back when uncertainty appears. And this idea gives him a comforting illusion of control, as though he is no longer just a passive participant but an active strategist shaping his own financial future. Yet what Winston does not fully grasp is that this shift, while it feels like progress, is quietly pulling him into one of the most statistically destructive behaviors in personal finance, because the more he watches the market, the more he feels compelled to respond to it, and the more he responds, the more his decisions become influenced not by long-term logic but by short-term emotion, where optimism encourages him to enter when prices are already high, and fear pushes him to exit when prices have already fallen, creating a cycle that feels proactive but consistently works against him. And occasionally, he experiences small wins, moments where a decision appears to pay off, reinforcing the belief that he is learning, improving, gaining an edge. But these moments are deceptive, because they mask the larger pattern of underperformance that emerges over time. As transaction costs accumulate, taxes quietly reduce his gains, and missed opportunities from sitting on the sidelines begin to add up. And what makes this trap particularly dangerous is that it consumes not only his money but also his attention, drawing him into a constant state of monitoring, reacting, and second-guessing, until investing, which should have been a simple long-term process, becomes a source of stress and distraction, ultimately leaving Winston in a position where he is working harder, thinking more, and yet achieving less than if he had simply trusted a consistent, disciplined approach from the start. As the seasons quietly pass, Winston finds himself sitting once again at his desk, surrounded by neatly stacked papers and softly glowing numbers on his screen, carefully entering information into a tax filing software that guides him step by step, asking simple questions and producing a final result that he accepts without much hesitation. Because to him, taxes have always felt like something inevitable, something fixed, like the weather. Unpleasant at times, but ultimately beyond his control, and so each year he repeats the same process, files what is required, pays what is calculated, and moves on without giving it much further thought, never stopping to consider that this passive approach may be costing him far more than he realizes, because what Winston does not yet understand is that taxes are not merely an outcome. They are a system, one that can be influenced, shaped, and optimized through deliberate decisions made throughout the year rather than at the final moment of reporting. And while he spends time comparing prices, searching for discounts, and finding small ways to reduce everyday expenses, he unknowingly overlooks what is likely the largest financial outflow in his entire life, one that quietly consumes a significant portion of everything he earns. And the difference between those who build wealth and those who remain stuck is often not how much they make, but how much they are able to keep, because others, perhaps not more intelligent but simply more aware, structure their finances in ways that reduce their taxable burden legally, using tools such as retirement contributions, strategically timed income, and investment choices that are treated more favorably under the tax system, while Winston continues to focus almost entirely on increasing his income through effort alone, leaving efficiency untouched. And over time, this gap widens. Not in obvious, dramatic ways, but in small, consistent advantages that accumulate year after year, until one path leads to quiet financial strength while the other remains stuck in a cycle of effort without optimization. And the most unsettling part is that this difference was never hidden or restricted. It was always available, waiting to be understood, yet never explored. At some point, in a quiet moment between tasks, Winston begins to notice a subtle discomfort that he can no longer ignore, a lingering awareness that despite all his effort, his current path is not leading him where he once hoped it would, because his work, though stable, no longer challenges him. His income, though consistent, no longer grows in meaningful ways, and deep down, he senses that there are opportunities beyond his current environment, roles that value his skills more, paths that could accelerate his progress. Yet every time this thought surfaces, it is quickly followed by another, one that feels heavier and far more convincing: the fear of change. Because changing jobs would mean stepping into uncertainty, adapting to new systems, meeting new expectations, and temporarily losing the comfort of familiarity that he has spent years building. And so he hesitates, telling himself that stability is responsible, that patience is wise, that staying put is safer than risking disruption. But what Winston fails to recognize is that this perceived safety is an illusion, because while nothing appears to be going wrong on the surface, something very real is being lost beneath it. As time continues to pass, inflation quietly reduces the value of his earnings. His skills risk becoming outdated in a rapidly evolving world, and opportunities that once seemed within reach slowly drift further away. And if he were to measure the true cost of this hesitation, not just in immediate discomfort but in long-term impact, he would see that each year of delay is not neutral. It is expensive, representing lost income, slower growth, and a narrowing of future possibilities. Yet the mind rarely calculates these invisible losses. It focuses instead on avoiding immediate discomfort, making the decision to stay feel justified, even rational, and so Winston remains where he is. Not because it is the best choice, but because it is the easiest one, unaware that in trying to avoid risk, he has chosen a path where the risks are simply hidden, delayed, and far more certain over time. One afternoon, while walking past a row of newly built homes, Winston slows his steps just slightly, his eyes lingering on the solid structures, the quiet sense of permanence they seem to represent. And for a brief moment, he imagines what it might feel like to own something like that. A place that is not just a cost, but a foundation. Yet almost immediately, that thought is replaced by a series of familiar objections that he has heard many times before. Housing is expensive. Markets are unpredictable. Renting is more flexible, and buying might tie him down. And while each of these concerns contains a degree of truth, together they form a narrative that keeps him comfortably on the sidelines, allowing him to postpone the decision indefinitely without ever fully examining the long-term implications. Because from Winston's perspective, renting feels simpler. His monthly payments are predictable, his responsibilities are limited, and he can move whenever he chooses. But what remains less visible is the silent difference in trajectory that unfolds over time, as each rent payment disappears completely, leaving no residual value behind, while an alternative path, though more demanding, would gradually convert similar payments into ownership, building equity piece by piece, creating a form of forced discipline that accumulates into something tangible. And beyond that, there are additional layers he has not fully considered, such as the way a fixed mortgage can become easier to bear as inflation rises, or how property ownership can offer forms of financial leverage and stability that are simply unavailable when one remains a renter indefinitely. Yet despite these potential advantages, Winston continues to delay. Not because he has concluded that renting is superior in his specific situation, but because the decision itself feels complex, heavy, and easy to postpone. And in doing so, he unknowingly allows time to make the decision for him. As years pass, prices shift and opportunities that once required courage begin to require even more, turning what was once a difficult choice into an even more distant possibility, all while his financial path remains unchanged. Steady on the surface but quietly missing a powerful mechanism for long-term growth that, when used appropriately, could have significantly altered his future. As Winston grows more cautious over time, he begins to take a certain comfort in avoiding anything that feels uncertain, gradually shaping his financial behavior around the idea that safety must always come first. And so, he keeps a large portion of his money sitting quietly in low-yield accounts, untouched and seemingly secure, reassuring himself that at least it cannot decrease in value overnight. And while this approach gives him a sense of control, it also creates a hidden consequence that unfolds slowly, almost invisibly, as inflation steadily reduces the real value of everything he has worked so hard to save, turning what appears to be stability into a gradual form of loss that never announces itself. And this pattern extends beyond just where he keeps his money, influencing how he thinks about opportunities as well. Because when he considers the idea of starting something new, whether it is a side business, a different career path, or an investment that carries short-term volatility, his mind immediately focuses on what could go wrong, constructing detailed scenarios of failure that feel far more real than the potential for success. And as a result, he chooses inaction, believing that by avoiding risk, he is protecting himself, when in reality he is accepting a different kind of risk, one that is quieter but far more certain, the risk of stagnation, of missed growth, of never fully reaching the level of financial freedom that he once imagined. And what makes this trap particularly deceptive is that it rarely feels like a mistake, because nothing dramatic happens. There are no sudden losses, no obvious setbacks, just a slow and steady limitation of possibility, where each safe decision builds upon the last, forming a life that is stable but constrained, secure but unchanging. Until one day Winston realizes that, while he has successfully avoided many potential downsides, he has also unknowingly avoided most of the meaningful upside, leaving him with a future that feels predictable, but far smaller than it could have been if he had been willing to take carefully considered risks along the way. After long days filled with effort and quiet endurance, Winston often finds himself seeking small moments of relief, subtle ways to acknowledge the work he has done and the pressure he has carried. And so, without much hesitation, he allows himself certain rewards: a slightly more expensive dinner than usual, a new item that he convinces himself will improve his daily life, or an experience that feels deserved after everything he has handled. And in those moments, the decision feels harmless, even justified, because it aligns with a simple and deeply human belief. That effort should be followed by reward, that discipline should earn comfort, and that hard work should translate into something immediately enjoyable. Yet what Winston does not fully see is how this pattern quietly expands alongside his income, shaping his expectations in ways that are both subtle and powerful, because each time his earnings increase, so does his sense of what he deserves. And gradually, what once felt like an occasional indulgence becomes a standard, something that no longer feels optional but necessary to maintain his sense of balance. And as this cycle continues, his financial progress becomes constrained not by a lack of income, but by the continuous elevation of his lifestyle, where every gain is matched by new spending, ensuring that very little is left to build something lasting. And when viewed in isolation, each decision seems insignificant, a small cost for a moment of satisfaction. But when viewed over years, even decades, the cumulative effect becomes staggering, as money that could have been invested, allowed to grow, and eventually provide freedom is instead consumed in the present, leaving no trace beyond the memory of temporary enjoyment. And perhaps the most challenging aspect of this trap is that it does not feel like a mistake. It feels like living, like enjoying the fruits of one's labor, making it incredibly difficult to question without feeling as though something important is being sacrificed. Yet the deeper truth is not that Winston should never reward himself, but that without balance, without intention, these rewards can quietly become the very mechanism that prevents him from ever reaching a point where he no longer needs to trade his time for money at all. As Winston sits once more in the quiet of his room, the soft glow of the city fading outside his window, he begins to see his situation with a clarity that had never fully formed before, not as a series of isolated choices, but as a pattern, a system of behaviors that, while individually reasonable, collectively shaped a path that kept him moving without truly advancing. And for the first time, he understands that nothing about his financial future is random. Nothing is purely the result of luck or circumstance, but rather the outcome of decisions repeated over time, decisions that can be examined, adjusted, and ultimately redirected. And this realization, though slightly unsettling, carries with it a quiet sense of control, because if these invisible traps were built through habit, then they can also be dismantled through awareness, not all at once, not through drastic changes, but through small, deliberate shifts in how he approaches his money. Choosing to understand rather than ignore, to think long-term rather than react short-term, to evaluate opportunities rather than avoid them out of fear, and to define rewards in a way that supports his future rather than undermines it. And as these thoughts settle, something changes within him, not dramatically, not in a way that would be visible to others, but in a deeper, more enduring way, where his perspective begins to shift from simply maintaining his current life to intentionally designing a better one. And in that moment, Winston realizes that financial freedom is not a distant destination reserved for a select few, but a direction, one that becomes available the moment he chooses to step away from the patterns that once held him in place and begins, however quietly, to move forward with purpose.